If the City of London was a country, it would rank as the world's 9th highest CO2 emitter, according to research from Greenpeace. And I'm not even talking about the whole residential area of London, just the financial district known as the City. Emissions which are funded by this district are almost double the whole UK's annual carbon emissions. How is this possible? Unlike other industries, the finance sector is often overlooked when it comes to government decarbonisation targets. While big oil companies are expected to track a path to net zero, the banks that lend to them aren't. This means that most of the targets that our government agreed to in line with the Paris Climate Agreement can be ignored by the financial sector. London's banks, asset managers, and insurance companies are driving climate chaos around the world. In 2019 alone, lending from financial institutions headquartered in the city supported 805 million tonnes of CO2 emissions, nearly double the annual emissions of the entire UK at 455 million tonnes, and staggeringly, even more than the 776 million tonnes emitted by the whole of Germany. Barclays, a well-known UK bank, is Europe's biggest funder of fossil fuel projects, with a whopping $146 billion being invested in tar sands, coal power, and fracked oil and gas. HSBC is responsible for a further $111 billion. Standard Chartered another $31 billion, NatWest a further $13 billion, and Lloyds another $12 billion. All of this investment has taken place since the Paris Climate Agreement, which tells us one thing: we can't tackle climate breakdown without regulating the banks that finance it. So how do we take back control? The financial system relies heavily on us, the public. During the 2008 crash, the banks were bailed out and we were the ones who paid the price. The financial system couldn't exist without us, the public. Without public institutions like the central bank and the Treasury, the UK's finance sector would collapse. If these systems are using our taxes for climate destruction, they must be subject to democratic oversight. In November this year, our government is hosting COP26, the United Nations Climate Conference. Boris Johnson has said that the world must get serious about tackling climate change. But his government is letting the financial sector trample over the climate agreement by investing billions in fossil fuel production every year. The Bank of England already has the ability to regulate this industry under a green mandate, but not nearly enough is being done to tackle climate breakdown at the pace and scale demanded by the recent IPCC report. As we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need a Green New Deal that will create jobs, reduce inequality, and get us to net zero fast. And that Green New Deal must include measures to ensure the UK's massive finance sector is supporting decarbonisation, not funding climate breakdown. We should be setting an example by truly leading the world, not turning a blind eye where we see fit. Without regulation in the financial sector, it will be impossible to transition to a true green economy. With COP26 coming up, the government must act now to make this happen. As citizens, we have the power. Now is the time to use it.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Gaia Sriskanthan, and I'm an elected representative on the Momentum governing body and the current Momentum co-chair. I'm very excited that we're having this important discussion during the week that Extinction Rebellion is rightly drawing attention to the incredibly damaging impact of the UK's financial centre, the City of London. Given the scale and neck-breaking speed of the climate crisis, it is imperative for us to understand the major levers of change that need to be pulled in order to arrest runaway climate change rapidly. The central question of why our leaders haven't acted quickly enough can be answered by looking at where power lies. We on the left of the Labour Party movement know that political and economic power has persistently stayed with the 1% who make decisions that serve their interests and the interests of a handful of shareholders above the needs of the 99%, even when the result is the destruction of the very planet that we collectively depend on for our survival. Nowhere is this clearer than the City of London, which remains one of the linchpins holding in place the systems of power and patronage that really pull the strings. its vested interests determine what we can and can't do, on what ideas or so-called solutions are allowed to be discussed, and what ideas must immediately be discredited and neutralized. The city and the global financial system as a whole are dependent on public money to maintain their viability, privatizing their fortunes and socializing their losses as they did in the 2008 financial crisis. It is time that we held them accountable for the use of our money. The banks must be subject to measures that put them under democratic public oversight so that their destructive activities can be curtailed. This includes taking banks into public control and must start with immediate regulation, something that can be done right now if there was the political will to do so. Momentum members have voted for us to support a global climate justice motion for Labour Party conference, which includes proposals to bring the banking and financial system into democratic public control in order to fund a just transition, and to regulate private banking and finance for its climate impact. It also includes reference to delisting from the stock exchange companies failing to protect the environment and uphold human rights, and asking that future stimulus and bailout eligibility be linked to climate action and a just transition for workers. There is also an excellent motion by Labour for a Green New Deal and a green jobs revolution that complements this for a full platform of climate justice at home and abroad. We encourage all of you to view and support these motions, and you can see them on our website. These are the kinds of policies that the public should ask for across political lines as viable pathways towards rapid and just action. We're incredibly lucky that we'll be able to hear directly from some esteemed experts on this topic today, including politicians who have been asking for measures like this for years. These ideas are more timely than ever. I now have the honor of welcoming Asad Rehman as the chair of our event tonight to introduce our speakers. Asad is the executive director of the radical anti-poverty and social justice organization War on Want. Founded and rooted in the labor movement, it works to achieve a vision of a just world through their mission to fight against the root causes of poverty, inequality, human rights violation, and defending workers' rights in the UK and globally. He is a leading climate justice activist whose work has helped to reframe the climate crisis as a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, inequality, and racism, and is coordinator of the Global Green New Deal project. Over the last 35 years, he's worked with many social movements, both globally and nationally, including the anti-racist movement, the alter globalization movement, and the anti-war movement. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Asad, and I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gaia, and welcome, comrades, sisters, brothers, friends. You don't need me to tell you, of course, that last month climate scientists issued the latest code red warning to humanity. Temperature levels increasing faster than predicted, impacts more severe than predicted, and time running out to prevent a breach of the critical 1.5 degree guardrail. Less than 5.5 years at current rates of emission. And at just over 1 degree warming, we have all seen the fires, floods, and famines in every corner of the world, reinforcing the message that many of the climate justice groups have been saying for a decade or more: no temperature increase is safe and is deadly for many. And despite all of these countless promises made by government leaders, by big business, we are, of course, still heading towards a catastrophic warming of the planet of 3 degrees. And belatedly, many in the mainstream environment movement have moved on from empty calls to act towards calling for an end to the fossil fuel industry. Some call for divestment, others call for sustainable or green capitalism, ignoring the fact that, of course, the origins of the climate crisis cannot be separated from capitalism, but neither can it be separated from racism and colonialism and the very logic of sacrificing people and planet for profit. Today, we have an incredible panel of speakers to set out what we as progressives should be demanding. So before I turn and introduce all them, let me just start with a few words about why this is such an important discussion and why demands here in the UK are critical in the fight for both climate, economic and global justice. Britain, as we know, is the 5th richest economy in the world. And of course, that's linked to the reality that we're also the 6th most responsible country for causing the climate crisis. And as we know, you can't separate the climate crisis from from the logic of the deliberate impoverishment of so much of the world, the crisis of inequality and the wealth accumulation by the elites in the global north. And whilst it's said that the banks provide the financial oxygen that allows the fossil fuel industry to breathe, nearly 4 trillion handed over in the last 5 years alone, but it's the City of London that provides the financial oxygen that for racialized capitalism to continue to exploit. From financing the slave trade to profiting from plantations that finance the Industrial Revolution, we know that every brick and mortar in this country has been forged in the violence of exploitation. And it was the City of London's expertise and experience of colonialism, empire, the expropriation of land and resources, and the channeling back of that wealth back to the UK that it replicated when establishing the international financial system in which the City of London sits at its heart. And today, we know that extraction of wealth and resources is facilitated through banking, insurance, asset management, financial services. Incredibly, the bank's assets here in the City of London are about 8.14 trillion. Over 10% of all global foreign companies are listed in London, as are 250 foreign banks. And of course, its exchanges include not only the stock exchange, but also the London Metal Exchange, the second biggest in the world, trading 11.6 trillion annually, with British banks currently owning 1 trillion of Africa's mineral wealth, more than the combined GDP of every sub-Saharan country in Africa. Its power and influence shapes government policy, enabling Britain to become the world's largest tax haven. Secrecy and deregulation are its mantra, even whilst it announces sustainability plans, greenwashing its role as the driver of our failed economic system, and of course, one of the biggest culprits of the planetary emergency. So if we're to stop hurtling over the edge, we of course must go beyond tinkering around the edges and make the demands that are commensurate with the urgency of the crisis we face. So who better to help us answer that first question than our first speaker, which is Anne Pettifor. Anne leads little introduction. She is an esteemed political economist who's known for her work on sovereign debt and international financial architecture. Anne is currently the director of the Policy Research in Macroeconomics, a network of economists that promote Keynes's monetary theory and policies. She has, of course, also was very famously predicted the 2008 financial crisis several years before it began, and one of the first proponents of the Green New Deal before the concept became more widely popularized by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. So over to you, Anne. I want to ask Anne the question, to help us overview the current global financial system and its contribution to the climate crisis, and maybe explain a little bit more about the special role that the City of London plays in that.
Thank you so much, Asad, and thank you for having me. Can I also say how proud I am of Momentum for making this link between the City of London finance and the climate. And for too long, we focused in our silos if we were working on climate on the one hand and in another silo called finance on the other. And what's wonderful about today's meeting is that we're bringing these two things together. So I think for us to understand the financial system, we need to understand that it's, in a sense, it's kind of a split, or it's a split institution. On the one hand, it is physically situated in Wall Street right now, being flooded by climate breakdown, and in the City of London, right at the heart of London. On the one hand, it's rooted and sited in this city. And on the other hand, it's mainly offshore. It mainly operates beyond the boundaries of democratic debate and accountability. That's what they regard as so wonderful about their role in the world. Today, there's been a really terrific scandal in the United States where the Sackler family that owned the company that effectively killed 500,000 people with a highly addictive opioid cannot be penalized for what they've done, because to the judge's frustration, most of their money is parked offshore. And that's the power that the City of London has, and that's the power that global finance has. And they have that power because we, and I speak here about the citizens and the governments of democratic states, have, since in particular 1971, agreed to remove any border controls over the movement of capital. So capital mobility means that, you know, while poor Afghans may stick at a border and at the perimeter of an airport, and in the hope of being able to get across the border, finance has no such problem. Finance can cross borders effortlessly. And the reason that matters, and the reason that the City of London is such a drain on us, the taxpayers of Britain, is that this ability to shift their funds offshore, just by entering numbers into a computer, means they can avoid taxes. As well as the fact that they can do as they please, essentially, and move money when they like and affect our currency, our rate of interest, our level of taxation, all of this. They're in control of it, and they designed it in this way. One of the things I really think is most important for everyone to understand is this is not a natural system. It may have been in existence when you were born, but the fact is it's a constructed system. It's an architecture. It's been built and designed mainly by men, right? And we can dismantle that architecture and we can rebuild and create a new architecture. And we absolutely have to. And the first element of the architecture must be this, that there must be controls over the mobility of capital. And if we may not want to call them controls, we might say we want to manage the flow of capital across borders, so that if you want to send money to Africa because as a remittance, that might be possible and we won't object to that. But on the other hand, if you want to just dodge paying taxes, or if you want to invest in fossil fuels, then we would like to know about what you're doing. So, and we want to manage that process. So capital controls, for me, is an absolutely fundamental demand that must come from the left, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I want us to understand the City of London as physically located here in London, and as massively dependent, as Grace said in her introduction, on public institutions. The Bank of England is a nationalised bank. It was nationalised in 1945 by the Labour government because of the role it had played in the deep financial crisis in the Great Depression of the 1930s. The bank had served the interest of the City of London and not the people of Britain. And as a result of that, the Labour government felt it had to take control. And the bank is still a public institution. It is still a department of government, no matter what all the talk of independence might be, right? And the Bank of England offers to big capital, to big finance, to all the big institutions that move their money across borders and that work in the City of London, enormous powers, the power to access the currency, the power to engage in the market for government bonds, which are incredibly valuable assets for the finance sector. In fact, government bonds, government debt, are like the foundations of the house that finance builds. Without those foundations, because no other asset in the world, no property, no London property in Mayfair, no racehorse, no work of art is as safe and as valuable as the promise by the British government to repay its debts, right? It's called a bond. And that debt is an asset. We think of it as a debt and as a problem, and the right like to frighten us by saying this is a very big problem. The finance sector can't get enough of that debt. They can't get enough of that collateral, because it's collateral, because it's an asset, and they can use that asset to leverage additional borrowing. In other words, they can use the asset, the collateral, the government bond, government debt, as a means of raising additional finances, borrowing money, right? And we need to understand, why are we allowing these banks that lend money to fossil fuel companies to access the market for government bonds? Why are we allowing them to access the sterling, to obtain sterling through the Bank of England? Why do we allow them to register with the Bank of England so that they can operate here? Why do we do that? Because we, the taxpayers, are paying for those institutions that they depend on. One of the institutions that's absolutely vital to the private finance sector is the judicial system. They rely, we have Russian oligarchs come to London to enforce their contracts, because the judicial system in Britain, financed by you and me and maintained by you and me, and those people are employed by the taxpayer, the judicial system enforces contracts in a way that no institution in Russia can do. And so they come here to settle their divorces and their arguments. we ought to say that, yeah, you may be able to use these institutions, but these are the terms and conditions that we, the taxpayers, the citizens of Britain, impose on you in order to have access to these valuable assets and institutions that have been built on our money, with our money. And I think it's because we don't understand that power, because we don't even know that it is a power. We don't believe we have that power. We think the City of London is this magical world, that it's extraordinarily powerful, and that it creates all that power from their own brilliance, basically. We don't understand that they rely on us. They rely not just on us as taxpayers and as citizens with institutions like the Treasury and the Bank of England. They also rely for collateral on the ecosystem. Now, the really key thing about the ecosystem is that the assets that the ecosystem provides are finite. This is what, neoliberals are discovering, that actually the land that we have is finite. You can't, they're not making it anymore, as Groucho Marx once said. They're not making new land. The other assets of the ecosystem are all finite in value. The atmosphere, the ecosystem is finite, but they also need those assets. So this is why, for example, private equity are fire hosing, as the City of London is fire hosing private equity firms to buy up land in Britain. And at the moment, the Daily Mail is up in arms about this. They're going around buying up all these valuable assets because they need assets or collateral in order to leverage additional borrowing, more money, and to, reward their shareholders. So what we're finding is that there's now a shortage of those assets. They're coming to the limit. They're finding there's a limit to those assets, and they're grabbing everything they can get their hands on. And our government says, help yourself. Do as you please. We're not going to stop any of this. We're not going to restrain you from buying Morrisons and sacking workers and dumping the pension fund. No, do as you please. The market's deciding this. It's the invisible hand. And we, the citizens, are sitting there and saying, well, maybe it is the invisible hand. What can we do about it? Or we can demand that our governments begin to rein in these powerful institutions and do that in order to sustain not just society and social justice, but also the ecosystem. And until we understand that power and exercise that power and make those demands of governments for capital controls, for regulation over the bank, over the City of London, for terms and conditions for bailouts, for so long will we, the citizens of Britain, be exploited. But even worse, will the citizens of Africa and other low-income countries around the world be exploited. So, we have a responsibility and we have to take it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And very nicely segues into our next speaker, who's a great friend and comrade and somebody who's utterly inspiring, who actually has been dedicated her life to challenging those unequal power relations at the global level. Priya Luka was the first ever female chief development economist for Christian Aid, worked targeting at both the UN and the World Bank. She's an economist in international development and has been looking at the neocolonial reasons why poverty still exists, of course, in a world of such abundance. And currently a visiting research fellow at Goldsmith University, she has been doing some of the most groundbreaking work on what reparations mean in the context of tackling both the climate and economic crisis. Priya, so delighted to have you here.
Thanks, Asad. And Bhumika and I are going to chat together about some of the issues that we're collaborating on the themes of this debate. First of all, just amazing to hear Anne, just loved everything that you've just said. So I think for us, for Bhumika and I, as two women having worked in macroeconomic reform agenda spaces, we've got some contributions to make around this, where we are now, which is the urgency of the world's climate change crisis deepening, and what we're seeing, which is the visibility of wars to further imperialism really being exposed now in the public space. And our background is we're working with a range of social justice activist movements on re-envisioning economics and economic systems to be responsive to the needs of global majority people. So within that context, like some of my current thinking and things that I've been working on is really looking at the glaring gap and the need for mandated regulation on climate change. Some of it is around the need for economic policy making to be reimagined, and some of it is directed at the nature of multilateralism itself, like really rethinking global economic governance. But I wanted to start like just thinking about the global economic, macroeconomic kind of outlook, really. So globally, if we think about the situation we're facing and how this impacts on global majority people, we have like low profitability and rising debt, which is manifesting as low growth in productive investment, real incomes and trade, that the world's major economies, I call them countries that stronghold others, those economies have been locked into this low productive investment for the last decade. And in the pandemic, what we've seen is governments and central bank, including our own central bank, our own Bank of England, using the debt model even more in the hope and expectation of reviving economies after the lockdowns have ended or ceased to exist. But this is really unlikely to happen because profitability will remain low and debts will rise by this huge kind of credit expansion that we're in. So what happens in this situation? So what we see is capital owners looking for new frontiers. And that profit is to be found in the continued and government-enabled fossil fuel expansion. So I've spent several years before coming into kind of international development as a FS regulator and have regulated HSBC. And I know that its influence is bigger than any state. And it's that model, it's immense size and kind of presence that allows it to have the blueprint for why climate change continues to wreak havoc in the way that it does. I've also then gone on to campaign for a number of years at CushionAid against HSBC's fossil fuel policies. And what's really critical here is the realization of the principles of equity. And I think that when we think about going ahead, what's needed, the link between City of London, fossil fuel policies and the climate crisis, what we need is a recognition that former colonial states and companies should pay for adaptation and resilience for former colonized states. That is the essence of the principle of equity, first of all. So if we think about a principle of reparations and restoration and applying that to the universal problem of climate change, it really gives us guidance and a kind of map around what entities should do what and in what proportion. However, we have, senior, global regulation figures like Mark Carney, the Special Advisor for Climate Negotiations, indicating that reform can happen already within a strong regulatory framework and within the existing financial architecture. Now, I think it's really important to understand that most reparationists would strongly disagree with this and advocate actually that systems change is needed to avoid the catastrophe that we're facing. Coming back to HSBC currently has stakes in firms that plan more than 70 new coal plants, and its asset management arm is not bound by any pledge at all to stop financing coal, even though those new plants will emit hazardous air pollution. And even its phase out plans are still really enabling deaths happening on a massive scale. And I think that that's really important to recognize. I mean, over the years, I think that, what we see HSBC doing with its global policy is perpetuating dependence on the dirtiest forms of power generation in countries that are already among the most polluted in the world. And the coal plants expected to be built are in countries like Bangladesh, China, India, Philippines. So we can expect tens of thousands of more cases of death and disease that will be directly linked to HSBC's coal power plants. And that really underlines the urgency of the shift. But it has more recently bowed to some investor pressure over its support of fossil fuels earlier this year by vowing to phase out financing of coal-fired power and coal mining by 2030 in developed countries and by 2040 elsewhere in the world. I think for me, this kind of commitment in itself shows the differential standard of tackling climate change, and why the term of like the global south being ignored is so visible. And it shows also intrinsically financial markets relationship with empire. Nothing in the climate change agenda so far is mandated in the way that it needs to be. And what we actually see is piecemeal change or small corporate gestures being celebrated as big wins. So is this regulatory capture? By that, I mean firms actually operating with the power that is bigger than states. And how could we think of multilateralism helping here? I think some of the things that Bhumika and I often look at and think about is that the colonial legacy is systematically, unfortunately, still written into the way that organizations governing the economy and the environment think, function, and work. And many of them are highly undemocratic, mainly white in color, decision-making being dominated by nations that financially control the most, rather than a representative model. And that's really important, because the lived experience of marginalized groups that would help to widen out their analysis is so missing. And even though economic and racial inequality correlate very strongly, there's still like a missing piece when it comes to economic policy making. But having said that, we are in a moment, and I do think that a lot of civil society organizations, economic justice campaigns, and environmental movements have been galvanized currently into this deeper engagement with the history of enslavement, including wealth. And I think this has brought us into an understanding of the current economic setup and how much it's derived from colonialism, particularly the financial sector in London. So what I would say is that this era of decolonization that we're in now presents actually a huge opportunity for economic policy making. And, you know, so much of my time, my career has been spent in marginal reform around economics. But I think that there is a real kind of genuine curiosity about what would advance social justice and societal progress for marginalized groups in a much stronger way. And I think this is where I'd say the concept of reparations really comes in, which is firmly based on the idea of repair of this damage. And most reparations movements don't just call for monetary compensation. They focus on a much more holistic form of justice, looking at the inequities of the global economy. So I'm going to hand over to Bhumika, and I'm sure she's got a few more things to add along these lines.
Thank you, Priya. Let me just quickly introduce Bhumika Machala. She's another great friend, an advocate, activist, educator on global economic justice, feminist economics, and decolonial frameworks. I worked with her for like 20 years in global justice organizations. She was there in 1999 in Seattle in the uprising against WTO and corporate globalization. She currently works for the Global South organization, Third Network, which is an amazing organization. You check it out. And she builds advocacy campaigns and does research analysis on austerity, debt, tax justice, and financialization. Bhumika, so delighted to have you as well.
Thank you, Asad, and thank you, Priya. Thank you, the stellar cast. I'm so honored to be here with all of you. So just wanted to follow up on some of the themes Priya was mentioning. So where I will start with is that to say at the outset, following Priya, that climate change action and indeed reparations requires the structural transformation of the global economic and financial architecture. So what that means, in fact, is to really locate the structural drivers of systemic and historical inequalities within the structures of debt, fiscal, and tax as the systemic drivers of fossil fuels and ecological extraction. So what this requires from the outset is to zoom back and look at injustice and inequality through a historical lens, looking at the ecological history of colonial extraction and accumulation, and locating the link between climate change and colonial reparations through not only the discourse of climate reparations and climate debt, but also through the specific need to reform and indeed transform the structures of international finance. So exactly as Anne was saying, and as Priya laid out, with the enormous power of the City of London and Wall Street to really look at debt injustice and to spotlight debt. And the reason I would spotlight debt is because the COVID pandemic has revealed indeed that we are in the thrust of a debt pandemic. The fact that debt levels have skyrocketed during COVID is no accident. This is a result of a historical and colonial legacy where the ability of developing countries to mobilize their own economies, diversify their industries, their sectors, to be able to have self-sufficiency, policy space, and sovereign autonomy in building their productive capacities and meeting their economic and social rights needs of their citizens has been structurally constrained. So we look at debt as a source of south to north resource transfer, or a fiscal drain that has its roots in the colonial era, where commodities and raw materials produced by slave labor, exploited cheap labor from colonies, were acquired without cost and sold in world markets at great profits. We look at today where there is a structural dependency on external borrowing due to historical plunder that has rendered most developing countries dependent on a cyclical borrowing loop to access international capital markets, to access short-term external financing, to borrow money at considerable interest rates, right? So today we see that debt payments from the poorest countries in the world is on average 144 million a day, while a large number of developing countries are today in the midst of a health pandemic allocating more of their public monies to debt servicing compared to their national healthcare and education sectors. And this is further exacerbated by an extremely unjust international tax system where multinational corporations siphon their profits directly to tax havens in tax haven sectors ranging from New York City to City of London to the Cayman Islands, that denies developing countries their actual public tax revenues. So the loss of this public tax revenue from tax haven drains then leads to an exacerbation of borrowing. There are such a confluence, it's such a perfect storm of structural factors that lead to this systemic dependency on external borrowing, and this need to access international capital markets keeps developing countries in an austerity bias. We have to locate the history and the ideological bias of austerity as having its power in the debt dependency of the global South. If developing countries want to be able to access external finance, they have to show, they have to prove that they can assure the market confidence of investors, that they can assure debt repayment. And this need to win the confidence of international investors and private capital markets requires a de facto implicit internalization of austerity measures, that we will do austerity in order to assure that there will be public funds to repay the debt. So this sort of structural dependency analysis is rooted in the post-colonial, analysis of Samir Amin, who talked about structural dependency in his ideas of dependency theory, where we look at the fact that the unequal exchange between developing and developed countries has indeed been accelerated since 1960. Academics have found in recent years that the drain from south to north totaled 62 trillion, or 152 trillion when accounting for lost growth, and this concludes that the intensity of exploitation and the scale of unequal exchange has increased significantly during the structural adjustment era of the 1980s and 1990s, affirming that drain from the south to north remains a core central feature of the world economy today, where rich countries continue to rely on imperial forms of appropriation to sustain their high levels of income, consumption, and way of life. So what we can do about this is really as activists, as movements, to really call for multilateral solutions to debt workout mechanism. You have Chapter 11 bankruptcy law for corporations, where they can work out their accrued debt and they can lend into arrears, and they have a way out, a door out needs to be provided for developing countries to get out of debt dependency, which is what keeps a lot of economic imperialism well and alive today. So one of the key calls of global movements is the call for a sovereign debt workout mechanism at the multilateral level that includes all creditors, especially private creditors that have refused to participate thus far in any debt relief mechanisms. And also to nuance that a debt workout mechanism is not just as simple as debt relief or debt forgiveness or debt cancellation. It is a systematic approach to fairly working out and restructuring debt so as to ensure the dignity and the right to sovereignty for developing countries. Thanks, and over to you, Priya.
Priya, are you coming back in?
No, that's perfect. I think that was brilliant.
No, that was brilliant. Every time I listen to both you and Bhumika, it's always a learning moment. And of course, many in the global south have been campaigning for decades against the financial system, setting out what the impacts were in their regions, advocating for a just financial system, what that would look like, calling on activists in the global north to act in solidarity with people in the global south. And our next speaker is one of those who has been at the forefront of really powerful advocate of rooted in social movements in the continent of Africa. Jeche Tano is a eco-socialist and an economist. He's an activist from Ghana. He's worked on global finance, trade and development, and he's currently now at the Hand and Brain Africa Activist Research Initiative. It's so good to see you, brother. Always inspiring to have you join us.
Thank you very much, Asad, and thanks also to Anne and to Priya and Bhumika for the overview, and also for the beginning to drill down analytically into the structures that interface that allow global finance to wreak the havoc that it does in the global south and in continents like Africa. And I think that is precisely the aspect that I'd like to illustrate to kind of give a more focused insight into the impacts of global finance on Africa and what this implies for climate finance, as well as responding to the climate crisis more generally. I think Priya and Bhumika began to talk in terms of the structural divisions of labor in the global system, which leads to the dependence of, let's say, continents like Africa and the global south in terms of production of raw materials to feed metropolitan industries and so on. But at the same time, of course, these two provide both an outlet for the large financial surpluses that are accumulated in the global north to find, to exploit cheap labor, to exploit monopoly proprietary rights over natural resources, and to gain super profits. So we know, for example, that when we saw the Ebola crisis break out in West Africa in 2013, 2014, it was the rapid expansion and the transformation of a local agricultural production of palm oil, the transformation by the entry of private equity funds, the enclosures of land, the expulsion of independent smallholder farming from the sector, and the transformation of a lot of the labor force into a cheap proletarian force was it is this breakneck speed which resulted in the crossover, the breakdown between the ecosystem, the crossover from virus carrying bat populations into the human food chain, and greater contact with humanity, and so on and so forth. So that microcosm of an example shows a number of things. It concentrates a number of things. On the one hand, it shows that global finance is at the arrowhead of the new scramble, what people have called the new scramble for Africa, the penetration of global interests, the consolidation of rights and property and monopoly position over natural resources, over the command of cheap labor and its product, and of course over the returns in terms of the control of the raw materials that are generated from natural resource economies. So, and these contribute to the directly both to the global climate crisis, but even more so to the ecological, the broader ecological crisis that is manifesting all over the world today, and especially in the global south, an ecological crisis which is causing daily deaths, environmental stress on communities, conflict, poverty on an unknown and unprecedented scale. And it is this type of emergencies that global climate finance is supposed to be able to respond to, is supposed to be able to help mitigate, is supposed to be able to help finance the adaptation to, but that's exactly what is not actually happening. I mean, the evolution of global finance in relation to climate shows this. In the first place, we saw in the earlier stages, the 1980s, perhaps even more so in the 1990s, we saw this transition from the debt for natural resource swaps to all kinds of things like the green bonds that we have seen more recently since the UNFCCC, the United Nations, set up the Green Climate Fund in 2010. We have seen an escalation of the capture of that space by global financial interest. Just a couple of examples to prove that. Green bonds have became very fashionable, and they have been issued especially as a mechanism to tap into so-called leverage the capacity of the global financial markets to generate the funds that will fund better use of the better environmental practices to mitigate carbon emissions and so on. One case in point is what we have seen, the global green bonds that were issued in a big project backed by the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank in Kenya, the Kaisuga project. This involved issuing 152 million worth of green bonds in London. It also involved, the backing of all the big financial players, Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan, name it, all the Bank of America, and so on and so forth, in different roles. It also involved that, the speculators who bought those bonds would be paid interests by the projects that they funded, so that the projects which were situated in Kenya have to generate every year enough return to pay these bondholders, and these bondholders can be paid either in the cash dividends that they get, or in actually having carbon credits which can offset emissions that they are responsible for elsewhere, and so on. So straight away you recognize that the downward pressure on livelihoods to generate the kind of surpluses required to pay back the bondholders is intensifies this process that Priya and Bhumika have described, and the speculative element that is involved, which does not even address the carbon emissions in the first place, because the emissions simply offset its production elsewhere, is also part of that process. This process of climate finance has continued to evolve. More recently, we've seen more exotic, especially since the much vaunted Paris Agreement. I think that was COP23 or so. We've seen that all these different financial packages involving the use of public funds, overseas development assistance, aid by the developed countries, to actually prime pump the process for private financial offshore private finance has intensified through what they call canopy agreements, where you package together a whole range of different factors. These green bonds, for example, that I just mentioned, are a case in point. There was a case in which, of the 72 million pounds that the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, put towards these green bonds, 10% went to what they call capacity building, which means that for the staff of the foreign companies involved, and for the staff of the World Bank and the IFC themselves, their staff time will be paid for to integrate this process in policy documents, which will describe that in the country of Kenya itself, this is a big, important, and highly positive green project. 10% of the funding went to that. About 16% of the funding went into debt financing for the project itself. Debt financing, which, as I've explained, is paid back by way of, to the IFC, but also in terms of the further surpluses that are generated and repaid to the bondholders. but 52%, 52 million of that 72, which means that 74% of all the green climate funds that were marked were to do one thing and one thing only. They were to prime the pump, be used to spend on, to ensure that the price of the carbon emissions for which the bonds do not fall beyond a certain minimum for the investors. In other words, there is a constant way in which the financial assets are being inflated and prime pumped and juiced up so that they become profitable for people, regardless of its impact on real people, real communities, real workers, and indeed on carbon emissions and stuff. And we see this classically in some of the more newfangled, climate finance initiatives that have developed, such as this business of, risk pooling for insurance. Now, in recent years, we've seen that this has come on stream, and that many developing countries, for example, in Africa, those at the coal face or the sharp end of the ecological disasters that I'm talking about, have been encouraged to buy subsidized insurance products, so that there will be a quick disbursement of global funds to enable them address specific hazards and climate fallouts and climate disasters and so on and so forth. And we see that many African countries have been encouraged, especially since the Paris climate meeting, to take this up. But increasingly, we find that there are deep flaws in this process. Number one, countries that do not, those countries buy insurance off the financial companies that issue the insurance, right? Okay. Now, the payback, so the payments take place, the premiums take place, but the payouts do not always take place. In countries like Malawi, Southeast Africa, one of the areas which is most, vulnerable to some of the rapidly changing erratic climate weather patterns and their various effects. A country like Malawi found that when it went into a climate crisis, a climate-related crisis, there was no payout. Why? Because apparently the actuarial model that was used failed to trigger, and therefore the insurance, insurance companies refused to pay out. Or you find countries like Senegal, like Mali, like Mauritius, countries that are at the heart of the Sahel, one of the most climate-stressed environments in the world. There was a refusal to actually pay out at all because the public projects that the governments of those countries had designed to use the payouts for, in terms of the implementation, the insurance companies didn't think that they were worthy enough by way of terms of carbon credits and so on and so forth. But so this is basically a fleecing of those countries in terms of them paying for insurance products, supposedly subsidized insurance products and so on. But there's a greater crime at the heart of it. The greater crime is simply this: why should those countries who have historically been emitting almost zero by way of net, climate emissions, be paying to address climate change? I thought the principle is that polluters pay. This is the inverse of polluters pay. So the process of financial power and monopoly and abuse and the superexploitation that attends these processes that have been described by Priya and by Bhumika and given a systemic overview by Anne, we see that in this very graphic form. So from that point of view, I think that's important, increasingly important, that when we attack centers, citadels of this inimical power relations, such as the City of London, we do so with a number of clear understandings in place. One of those clear understandings has to be that their tentacles have to be removed increasingly, drastically, radically from the valuation, from the investment, from the any benefits in the in natural resource sectors in the global south. Increasingly, we have to push them out. Increasingly also, it also requires us to do a number of other things. It requires us to ensure that those communities who are in those countries and parts of the global south begin to restore forms of production which are not so export dependent, such that they are locked into this situation. Okay, and that indeed they also begin to exercise control over resources, which allow them to recalibrate the way in which their capacity to generate production also enables them to generate appropriate technology to the local conditions in which they are, which appropriate technologies themselves also enhances their capacity to mitigate, to adapt, but also to generate the economic and productive means and wherewithal to constitute local relations that are, develops its own ecosystem of climate resilience. When Bhumika and Priya were describing the financial system, one of the things that Bhumika talked about was in terms of the the attempts by countries of the global south to constantly diversify their economies. It's not simply a good and desirable thing. It goes to the heart of what the financial system, a healthy financial system, ought to look like. Because if we're diversifying our economies, it means that people with a certain local eco zone, for example, may be better off producing certain type of agricultural products, or artisanal, cooperative, industrial technologies, or water harvesting, or all kinds of other appropriate scale types of technological interventions and production linkages, which then become the basis of their capacity to exchange with others and so on. It is the proliferation, the growth of coherent and sustainable minuses and pluses, credits and debits between peers that actually sustain a financial system. That is the original purpose of a financial system, that you have integrated within local economies, and with the public authority, a legitimate or an increasingly a public authority that's capable of being legitimized by its radical democratization, underpinning by way of its various interventions in that financial system, ensuring that there's a flaw to it, and so on. Those capacities to ensure that there will be a coherent financial system which can sustain itself because it's predicated upon real economic linkages between diverse economic activities which are manageable within certain zones, which can be scaled up or down as the case may be. It is precisely what is missing from the equation. If we think about it that way, then the appropriations, the exactions, the expropriations that global finance and the transnational regime in general, and the extractions that they take from Africa, mean that increasingly African countries and the global south and activists internationally, the capacity to mitigate and challenge that increases, as Bhumika was saying, the availability of public funds for these processes. But it also means that we're not looking at a static some pool of funds. We are looking really at the capacity of ordinary people increasingly to produce the things that they need along the basis of their own democratic planning, their own democratic ownership, and their own associations that they can generate among themselves. That is precisely what is required for the regeneration and resilience of a real financial system that provides valuable utility functions to the needs of communities, of working people, and so on. But it's also the model that will require for greater international cooperation. It's important for me to end on this point. The point is that the situation that we confront in the global south and in Africa in general is one that I think has important global ramifications. By the end of this decade, in the next 9-8 years, 60% of all young people under the age of 24 will be African. By the midpoint of this century, in 2050, 50% of all the fresh numbers, additions to the global working population in the world will be African. By the end of this century, 60% of the total population of the world, so to speak, will be African. Now, if we are talking about a whole population whose main contribution to the world is to drag down labor standards, is to drag down capacity and ability to survive, is to drag down, cheapen, cheapen the capacity of ordinary people and to stand independently, and to enable, increasing the powers to accrue to monopolies and so on. We will not be adding. We will be dragging down global standards for everybody in general. And that's why it's important that whatever we do, we are able to show people in Britain, people in the world, that today, that those same powerful forces wreaking this kind of havoc in places like Africa, actually there's an intimate connection between what they're doing and what they also do in their home countries as well, by way of austerity, by way of the way in which the financial system threatens people's mental health and their stability and their mortgages and their families' welfare and so on and so forth. So that apart from the question of principles, we can also build a conjoined practical agenda of resistance at home and abroad. It is no longer a question of thinking globally and acting locally. We must do both simultaneously, and do so to great effect in a way that radically changes not simply the system, the regimes that we live in, but the structures of power themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheche. I was waiting for you to take a breath. You speak faster than I do, so thank you for an amazing contribution. And just to everybody who's watching, please do in the comments add any questions that you may have. After our final speaker, we'll hopefully have some time for some Q&A, and I know all the speakers have touched on such really big issues, really woven together a very, very powerful story. And I'm sure many of you have got some burning questions for our panelists. So please put them into the comments and we will share them with the speakers after our next speaker, who's, of course, needs very little introduction, John McDonnell. He is, of course, the Labour MP for Hayes and Hillingdon in West London. I called the people, he's a northerner originally, and was a trade union official for both the NUM and then in the TUC. I first met him when he was in the GLC, and of course he was the former Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, where he had led the development of Labour's new economic programme, thinking really out of the box in terms of the kind of long-term investment that was needed and the kind of economic strategy that was required to tackle both the economic crisis, inequality, and the climate crisis. John, we're really delighted to have you join us. Over to you.
Thanks, Asad. I want to try and comment as much as I can on the contributions so far, which I think have been immense. I always have this view in recent meetings of, I just feel that maybe the children that are being born at the moment in 15, 25, 30 years' time will be maybe discovering some of the videos of these meetings that are taking place now. And they'll either think, thank God someone was thinking like this, and as a result of that, we develop policies which would address climate change and climate catastrophe. Or the fear I also have is they'll be looking back and saying, why didn't anyone listen at the time? Because their planet, our planet, will be under such threat, and they're very, well, existential threat. So I'm hoping that all the discussions that we have, and tonight the contributions have been, as I say, immense. I'm hoping that they lead to beyond interesting discussions, but into forms of action that enable us then to build a movement to tackle these issues. My own view is, as people know, we can build that through social movements. Of course, that's the foundation stone upon which we can influence government, but also the role that I've tried to play, and I think others now need to as well, is think hard about not just influencing government, but going into government. And that does mean about engagement, electoral politics through political parties. And there are struggles in political parties at the moment that we have to translate some of the ideas that we've heard tonight into concrete programs. But it does start with a recognition of some fundamental facts, which I'm afraid I don't think has really penetrated or permeated some of the political thinking of some of the political leaders that we have. And the first is, you should discover this when you, even as a backbench MP, you raise a political issue that is challenging the system, you soon discover, and then if you become a frontbench representative of a political party, you're in shadow ministerial office or even in government, you rapidly discover a number of basic facts. And the first is the corporate capture of governments, and particularly this government. And it isn't recent, it's a long history of corporate capture, of finance capital in particular of governments. And it goes back, in this country, it goes back to the East India Company dominating the government at that time and becoming integrated into government, into the integration of the expansion of the British Empire under military expansion and military rule in many continents, which then developed into the enslavement of people and the development of the City of London as a financial centre. But within that as well, we've got to also appreciate part of that corporate capture wasn't just finance capital, it was also fossil capital. And that was the basis of fortunes made through the Industrial Revolution, as this country was the first country that entered into the Industrial Revolution of 2 centuries ago. I think we have to acknowledge that. And that means, as Anne and others have pointed out, it's central to our political system that they have turned, because of this corporate capture by finance capital and by fossil fuel capital, is actually they have turned a blind eye to the tax avoidance, the money laundering. In fact, they've benefited from it in terms of the use of British overseas territories, the City of London being the funnel for the channeling of those resources to British overseas territories to enable them to avoid taxes and clean dirty money as well. And also, therefore, with that money, then use it on a vast scale to implement policies within the fossil fuel sector, which maximizes their profits, but at the same time degrades our environment overall, particularly in the global south. And the second element of that as well is the understanding that much as we've argued that the neoliberal dominance, hegemony, ideological hegemony is coming to a close, actually it's still strong. You know, this concept of the market knows best, always will provide the optimal solution, is still dominant within our political parties. The concept that privatization, private companies could always provide a better and more efficient service than anything under public democratic control is still there as a key element of government thinking and permeating actually most of the political parties within our country at the moment and elsewhere. So I think our role now is to translate the challenge of this hegemony, these ideas, and the challenge to the role of the British state with the real ideas about our analysis, which we've seen so far, but also into concrete programs of action that can convince people that actually in electing a government that's willing to tackle climate change, they can actually they can change their own lives, but also, more importantly, you know, they can save the world, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about an existential threat. I think there's a unique opportunity, and it's forced upon us. You know, the tragedy we've seen with what's happening in the global south, the floods, but also that's now penetrated into the thinking of those who experienced the California fires, the typhoons that yet again tragically have hit New Orleans, the typhoons and the flooding that's taken place across the world, even within Europe itself, and the floods in Germany, Belgium, and elsewhere. All of a sudden, actually, ordinary people now are saying, well, there's no such thing as an ordinary person, but people are saying, you know, we need to address this issue now. And people are discussing it. It is a matter of interest now, beyond any opportunities that we've had in the past. This one, I think, is absolutely critical, and we've got to seize it. A part of my job, I suppose, is, as an elected politician and also someone who was Shadow Chancellor, was to, as I say, try and translate some of these concerns and anxieties into real policy programs. And working with, some will remember that working with Rebecca Long-Bailey, we developed under Labour into the last two Labour manifestos, and the concept of the Green Industrial Revolution, what's now called the Green New Deal, the work that, building upon the work that many of who've spoken this evening brought forward, in particular, and Pettifor. And it was basically saying very simply, we can't leave it to the market anymore. We can't leave it to this laissez-faire approach. The state has a role to play, and what we've got to do is rewrite the rules of our whole economy. And we have to build new institutions under democratic and public control, which enable us, therefore, to have elements of control of our economy that we've really never had before, apart from in possibly wartime. And that is about new institutions and existing institutions brought under public accountable control, acting in the public interest, and in many instances, publicly owned. And that's exactly what we were seeking to do in the discussions that we've had over the last 5 years. And we put forward a very straightforward program as a model for discussion internationally about this is what we want to do in our own country. How would it work elsewhere? What ideas can we pick up elsewhere as well? And it was about the largest scale of state investment in modern times to fund the jobs and the industries of the future. And we were talking then about the creation of at least 1 million climate change jobs in every region and every nation of the United Kingdom. We proposed a green transformation fund. The figure we put on it then was initially a £250 billion investment program, which at that point in time was greeted with shock horror by the right-wing press and our political opponents. Now it pales into insignificance in comparison with both what's been spent over COVID, but also the needs that we now recognise about tackling climate change. But we also put forward the ideas about the institutions that we needed. And a lot of these themes have come forward tonight. We wanted a green national investment bank, which would ensure investment across all the regions and nations, the UK, focus solely on tackling the environmental problems that we have, sustainable investment overall, but under democratic control. Unions in particular having their say in terms of the development of policies for the workers that would benefit the workers in a just transition. We also said that actually we need to rewrite the rules of government. One of the first acts that I was to undertake when going into government was to rewrite what's called the Green Book, which was, the Green Book is only called green, not because it's environmentally sound, but because it's actually a green book. It's coloured green, the covers are coloured green. We were going to make sure we rewrote the rules so it was genuinely green. So every decision that government made over expenditure or investment was a decision that was to ensure that we promoted the policies that would tackle climate change. We wanted the Office of Budget Responsibility to have a responsibility for examining and assessing every decision made by the government, not just in financial terms and effectiveness or efficiency, but also in whether or not they were contributing towards our program of tackling climate change. And yes, we did. The issue Anne has raised about the Bank of England, yes, we did want to ensure it had not just a green mandate, but an effective green mandate, but it did take greater regulatory control of the banks, and where in some instances, yes, if necessary, bringing some into public ownership to ensure that we could direct them effectively in the way in which investment was engendered within our economy. We also, as people will know, we looked at our taxation system. We were looking at the way in which tax reliefs have been given to fossil fuel industries, not just to investment in our own country, but also to investment globally, and how that could be retrieved in that we would end the contribution of taxpayers to these fossil fuel using companies. We also said, yes, we would control the London stock market by ensuring that actually companies had recognized their responsibilities, not just nationally, but globally in their investments, so that they were assisting us in tackling climate change. And if they didn't meet climate change standards, the environmental standards that we put forward, they would be delisted from the stock exchange. I notice that that's come back into debate at the moment. Other political parties are now promoting that idea. At that point in time, I was looked upon as some form of outrageous revolutionary. Now it's become absolute common sense. And what we were looking at is to ensure that we developed the policies at every level. And that meant not just national government, but making sure we devolved powers to the regional bodies, to the national bodies that we had in terms of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, but also that we were developing community wealth building based upon local investments that would always ensure that they were sustainable in tackling the environmental problems that local communities face. We also brought forward policies, if people recall. We produced a report, Land for the Many, which George Monbiot set up a working group in which we said we could not address climate change unless we had increased control of what was happening to land use, both in terms of agriculture, but also in terms of the way in which we could restore the natural capital of our country. And that meant, yes, community land trusts, bringing land into common ownership again. And yes, land value taxation, so that developments that increase the value of land in certain areas, the benefits of that increase in value were shared by the whole community. But we also said that you can't tackle climate change unless you actually ensure that some of the ways in which your country or economy operates is done in a sustainable way. So transport became an incredibly important issue for us, as it is in terms of the issue around what happened with water and its privatization and the exploitation of a natural resource for profit as against the provision of a natural resource for all our benefits, but also the ensuring that the privatization that took place was undermining our ability, again, to harvest that natural resource. And that's why public ownership, I think, is a key element that we need to ensure remains on the agenda, both in terms of our rail system, our bus system, but also our water. And that leads us on then to the provision of energy overall. we were putting forward a massive program of alternative investment in terms of alternative energy sources, looking at 7,000 offshore wind turbines, 2,000 onshore wind turbines, enough solar panels to cover 22,000 football pitches. We were going to ensure that our energy was produced in an environmentally sustainable way, but it was produced in a way which created affordability for everybody. And the way that we thought we could do that only was if we brought energy back under public democratic control. And that meant public ownership of our energy companies. And of course, it led us on then to the discussions about what we would do about taxation overall. And that meant the end of the tax release of fossil companies, of course, but also it meant now looking at environmental taxes that would ensure that we tax some of the adverse effects of the taxation system up until now, that we would ensure that we were taxing those operations within our economy that were encouraging the use of fossil fuel, and then using that taxation to invest in alternative energy sources. That tax agenda would have meant also that we were redistributing wealth in a way in which also addressed the issues of poverty and deprivation within our society. And that led us on then to say, if we were developing this model within our own country, and trying to become the lead in Europe at least, but maybe globally, on what one government could do within its own national borders with an environmentally sustainable program, all that would be worthless if we were not working with others to tackle the issues globally. And that's why, Asad, you were with us. We had a social forum, a global social forum that we convened 2 years ago, where we brought together representatives of social movements from the global south to talk about what would they expect a Labour government to do to work with them to tackle these issues globally. And of course, that meant ensuring, yes, we controlled the City of London so that it ended the exploitation that was taking place, neo-colonialist exploitation of the global south still, that actually the tax resources that we were able to raise as a result of tackling tax avoidance and evasion that was going on such an industrial scale, those resources would assist us then in establishing a relationship, exactly as Priya and Bhumika said, in which we could then lead on to a discussion about the reform and transformation and restructuring of global finance. Again, because the City of London has played such a role over centuries in terms of its being the money launderer, the tax avoiding funnel, and the way in which some of these international institutions have been structured, we had a specific responsibility to work with others to foster the ideas about how that would restructure our global structures, whether it be the World Bank, the IMF, or the UN, but to make sure that they were truly democratic rather than dominated by some of the larger economies as it is now, and that therefore would ensure that all could benefit from a fairer distribution of the resources and the wealth globally. But that had to be a recognition, of course, too. That had to be a recognition about our own history in terms of the role of the City of London with regard to slavery. And of course, that meant that we had a specific role in ensuring the repair of the damage that our own country has undertaken and inflicted upon the global south over the last few centuries as a result of colonialism, imperialism, and the resulting enslavement of peoples. And that, yes, meant an acknowledgement that reparations had to come onto the agenda. As others have said tonight, it's financial reparations, of course, but it is more than that. It is also about the way in which we integrate our economies technically. How do we can share information? How do we share knowledge? How do we share the technologies that we need to tackle the climate change threat together? And in that way, maybe make up for some of the damage that we've undertaken in the past. Finally, let me make this point. I said the key element for me overall is to bring people with us. We can restructure our own economy in such a way, I believe, that we can demonstrate the economic, financial, social, and environmental benefits of a green economy structured here. I also think that we can win the argument on that doorstep when we're seeking votes. We can win the argument that yes, we can construct our own economy, but unless we take global action and undertake global solidarity, it will be worth nothing, because we're all affected by the global threat of climate catastrophe. And I think we can win that argument. And it's up to us now to ensure that we can mobilize the social movements that will influence governments, but also ensure that we participate in a way which takes us into government positions as well. Thanks, Asad.
Thank you, John. Every speaker has been such a font of knowledge and really amazing contributions. I'm just very conscious of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read out a few questions and then ask the panelists very briefly, a couple of minutes, just to choose one and just give a response. So, of course, we all know in 8 weeks' time, the eyes of the world are going to be on Glasgow as the UK hosts the COP26 summit. One of the issues, very pressing issue, is going to be around climate finance. And a decade ago, rich countries promised 100 billion. It's not been met. What has flowed has been largely loans or double counting of existing financial flows such as ODA. When the need of the transition, of a just transition, is at least some calculate about $1 trillion a year, what do you think what's the answers in terms of the sources? There's a question, does that require us for public expropriation of banks and finances? John, you talked about compelling narrative and story. I think one of the questions all of us ask ourselves is, how do we move the needle? What can ordinary people do to help on this particular issue? Third question was from Vanessa, was around the views about the panel's views on building social justice into the purchasing of and supply of goods and materials on a global level. Is that particularly achievable? And I will just ask one final question, which was around, recently people have looked at legal strategies as a way of changing the financial sector. Some have pointed out the court ruling against Shell and the compensation to local communities in the Niger Delta for their oil spills and the environmental devastation. Is that the beginning of the repair and reparations movement? So I will start again with the speakers in the way that you all joined, and 2 minutes each, please, and just choose any of those questions to give us an answer. Anne.
So first of all, thank you. I want to address the question of the narrative and what the people should do. And I would say, first of all, the left has to be very careful not to patronize the public. We have happening right now under our very noses a massive rejection of neoliberalism and of the global financial system. There's a new book out by a wonderful author, Paulo Garbaudo, who calls it The Great Recoil. People are recoiling from globalization. The ones that are not recoiling are the social democrats, the kind of left centrists, who insist on maintaining globalization, not just as, oh, that wonderful thing where the internet is and when we can travel freely, and isn't that wonderful, but also the financial system. Social democracy across Europe has been closed down, if you like, has been PASOKified, i.e. there's no more PASOK, there's no social democracy, no social democratic party in France. The German Social Democrats are making a bit of a comeback, but they've been extraordinarily weak because of their support for globalization, essentially. And the people have rejected that. The only politicians willing to represent the rejection, the recoil, have been on the right. It takes Johnson and the right, and it takes Donald Trump to say, look, we want to look after the domestic economy, we want to look at home and not focus on the global economy. Now, of course, they're doing it in the most reactionary way. We have ceded the leadership to the right on this important issue. What can we do? Well, first of all, I said in my opening contribution that we have to begin to assert our power over the public institutions milked and exploited by the private financial system. There's nothing private about it. The thing that the World Bank is doing is de-risking investment in Africa. saying to them, look, we know you don't believe in the free market any longer. There is no such thing as the free market. You want the taxpayer to guarantee your returns, right? I mean, that is bizarre in terms of capitalism. So, the world is alive to that. People are alive to that. People are very angry about this system, and they're rejecting it. The leadership, the political leadership, has not come from the left or from social, it's come from the right. We've got to change that. And one of the ways I think we can change it is by starting to talk, and I thought Cheche had a really powerful point to make. This is not about local action and global action. This is about both. And what we need, I think, is to reframe the debate to talk about internationalism, in the sense of international and in the sense of solidarity and working together on the terms of labor, and by that I mean the 99%, as opposed to globalization on the terms of the 1% of wealth, right? Right now, globalization, supported by so many social democrats, as well as, of course, by the right, is internationalism on the terms of the 1%. The world is currently governed in their interests. And we've got to change that narrative and say, we want internationalism, coordination, cooperation, work with the WHO to tackle pandemics, work with the UN to tackle climate breakdown, and has to be cross-border activity. But we want that new internationalism to be designed on terms that favor the 99%, not the 1%. That's how we can begin to change that conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll look at the question on the Niger Delta and the beginning of a repair and reparations approach, and exactly that. I do think that that's a really, really important moment to kind of recognize that there is now legal recourse, and there are movements that are now gaining traction and are making the steps towards kind of getting an acknowledgement of the need for repair and restoration. And what's happened against Shell is a really important symbolic point. And I think what I want to really stress is that that's not just a one-off case. There are several different examples across the world today which are similar cases where communities themselves are fighting for several years in collaboration with different partners, different activists, for reparations, for restore, for dignity, for commitments to non-repetition. And some of my work with the movements across the world is really to find the commonality between those different examples of reparations, where there's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions supporting that, whether that's at a state level. Some of it is more recently been directed directly to companies in London seeking compensation, seeking reparations from companies that have benefited from transatlantic slavery. There's been some work towards the Bank of England itself as well that's been documented. And I think for me, it's about finding that commonality, but also like thinking about the mechanisms for, how we can get economic reparations commensurate to the capital value of centuries of imperial plunder as well. One of the ideas that I know was there in a lot of the discussion earlier was a tax on the 28 trillion per day financial markets out of London, which provides the means for a reparations tax. And I think that, it's about kind of really looking at these kind of different mechanisms and struggles and cases and legal moves and legal kind of processes that are there, and understanding them as a kind of, a representation overall, and making the links between them and looking to add our solidarity where we can, and looking to resource them most importantly as well. So that's it from my end.
Sorry, Bhumika, you were on mute. I was wondering whether you could take the question about social justice in supply chains, whether that's one possible way of raising the finances to end debt repayments.
Sure, I can try to take that on, but I just first like to, if I may, very quickly follow the trail that Anne started, and really emphasize that we have to look at the role of the state as a strategic project, in that neoliberal economic ideology very effectively deployed the state to serve the market. And where, yes, in recent decades, it was done very specifically through the creation of macro structures, governing institutions, not to liberate the market, as the rhetoric often goes, certainly not to roll back the state, but rather to buff the state and empower and direct the state to encase and protect the market. So whether it is to de-risk private finance, whether it is to provide legal mechanisms such as the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism for legally binding structures to protect private profits, whether it's through the legally binding investment treaties and the competition rules and regulations in the World Trade Organization, or the lack of mechanisms in debt, you have a kind of distortion, a deformation of the role of the state to serve and protect the market through legal and governing means. So that, I feel, is the narrative, is the key narrative. It is not as simple as a public expropriation of private financial institutions and commercial banks and the big hedge funds. It is also about really redressing this role of the state in protecting and facilitating the economic and social rights of people, in autonomy, in sovereignty, in dignity, in rights, justice. And I think the conversation about rights as in economic and social rights, not limited to civic and political rights, but economic and social rights, that leads to the heart of liberalism, that leads into the conversation about reparations. And so one way that reparations can look like through the global supply chain in particular is where we consider this way in which the global value chain has very much attacked what my dear colleague Dete talked about, structural and economic diversification of economies. The global value chain ensures that most developing countries stay in the labor-intensive, low value-added, and most exploited run of the value chain ladder. So we have seen, as we all know, that the profit-making means of redesign in the intensive race exploit parts of the value chain are in the South. And one way in which import-export can be addressed through reparations is to address the constraints, the blockages to diversification in the global South, so that no more is there a tunnel vision dependency and singularity of extractive sectors, of mining, of labor-intensive primary commodities. So I think the way in which we can really redress import and export means and supply chain issues is facilitating diversification in the global South. So the global South is not dependent on exporting most dangerous mineral commodities and or relegated private commodities and raw materials.
Can you just wrap up?
Develop their own means to address climate change. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Cheche, I'm going to ask you, please be very, very brief. We're already over time. I'm going to ask you a very simple question in terms around climate finance and sources. We know the scale of finance that is needed for the global South is way beyond what is being put on the table. Do you think public expropriation of banks and finances is one of the answers for the sources? You're on mute. Cheche, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, public expropriation, I think, is certainly one of the answers. and not simply of the financial institutions, but all the institutions that they underpin as well. The point that Bhumika was just making in terms of global value chains, gives us an example. If there's expropriation of those natural resource extractive transnational companies, that helps. That expropriation can begin at a variety of different levels, including taxation, including restructuring of equity and ownership, and so on. And I think that when we do that, it also goes into the supply chain question in terms of global labor standards, global remuneration, ensuring that there's affirmative action for women, there's childcare protection, there's environmental protection, and so on. We can build a whole social justice agenda by focusing on the most pernicious strategic areas where global finance and global corporate interests and different imperialist states are intertwined. And I think that the way to do that goes back to what Anne said in terms of reconstructing a new internationalism. Because where that is important is that we must seek ways in which every single issue connects with the other in ways that empowers different levels of ordinary people's agency at every level where they are. If we are fighting for a new anti-debt campaign today, it must also reflect in what people in Britain, what is their debt? Student debt must be cancelled. The debt of African women in terms of the microfinance and micro lending must also be cancelled. I'm trying to say we should give real teeth to where people are really engaged and what they're struggling with at a given moment to ensure that taxing the big companies, expropriating them, putting more money into global finance, people interpret it from the point of view of how do I reheat, have heating in my home, how do I have repairs done to my families, where my family lays their head, and so on. We must conjoin these questions in a way that puts agency and the radical demands for restructuring relationships, pushing the corporate and profiteering interests back, putting ordinary people and their needs increasingly foregrounding those, ensuring that they do so in cooperative ways that actually ensures that the kind of democratic relationships that we're looking for are also born within that process itself. But appropriation is important. Expropriation is important because it puts the issue right on the agenda. It allows for no fudge, and it poses the kind of radical interventions that are required at this point in time. I think you're spot on there. We can build so much on the back of that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John, I'm going to turn to you with one very, very simple question. As I said, the UK is hosting the COP summit. In the next 8 weeks, we intend to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people up and down the country. There will be many, many demands. What should be the radical demand that the progressive part of our movement should be amplifying in the run-up towards the COP?
We need to take control of our economy to enable us to actually sustain our planet. Simple as that. But I just give you one simple demand. And Asad, you're the expert on this. Sometimes you can translate one part of the campaign into something that's effective. Sorry, we've all spoken too much tonight. You've had real difficulty chairing. I'm sorry, Asad, it's my fault as well. One simple demand is stop subsidizing the fossil fuel companies. Billions of our taxpayers' money is being poured into fossil fuel companies at the moment to subsidize their profits. One simple demand, end the subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. Simple as that. And I think we could get a large amount of support for that. And we link that to the just transition, working with our trade union movement. I think it's something that we can win on fairly easily.
Mainly because everybody who's spoken has been so enthralling. I've learned so much. I've really done terrible chairing that I didn't intervene, but I hope everybody enjoyed and learnt a lot from this incredible panel that we had, Anne and John, Jetshe, Priya and Bhumika. Thank you ever so much for making the time to join us. Thank you also to Gaia, who did an incredible amount of work pulling this together, momentum for centering the climate justice demands and connecting the fight here in the UK and globally, and of course to Casper and Matt, who did all the tech stuff behind to allow us all to connect with each other. In the coming weeks, there is a real responsibility on us as a movement here in the UK to amplify the voices and demands of the movements and our demands of our comrades in the global south. That's going to be our challenge. And I'm going to hand over to Gaia. I totally forgot you were speaking. Sorry, Gaia.
No, thank you so much, Asad. And I think you did a brilliant job moderating. And I just wanted to thank you and also thank our excellent speakers, Anne, Priya, Bhumika, Jeche, and John, for sharing their extensive knowledge and years of work and activism on this area. So I think it's really important that this message breaks through now. And we at Momentum feel that it's critical that all movements calling for economic and climate justice understand the deep links between the problems that they are protesting and the way our economic and political system are fundamentally structured. We have to rethink what activism on climate justice looks like to really take on the foundations of the system that currently has us locked into this pathway towards runaway climate change, while at the same time propping up gross inequality and injustice, both within and between countries. So this includes embracing rational and effective policies to, as John mentioned, others have mentioned, to bring our economy into democratic public control and ownership as a way to ensure that it is run for the interests of the many, not just the few. And from Momentum's side, we as an organization will continue to ramp up our work to connect the links between economic, social, racial justice and climate justice. We'll continue to push for policies that do so, both inside and outside the Labour Party, and to support our local groups to campaign for climate justice. We're also calling on all Momentum members to get engaged in mobilizations towards COP26, the climate talks happening in November the 6th, which is an important opportunity for a number of movements to come together and start strongly making a call for the system change needed. Thank you again, everyone, for all our speakers, to Asad, for everyone who showed up tonight and listened. I do urge you to get engaged and use your power, as Anne said, the power that you as the public have to challenge a system that is failing us. Thank you all.